You are watching this report. William Wallace was a Scottish knight who became famous for leading a rebellion against English rule during the Wars of Scottish Independence. He was executed by the English in 1305 for his role in the uprising. But why exactly was William Wallace executed? What was so bad that the King of England ordered one of the most brutal executions in history? Let's find out. Who was William Wallace? William Wallace was born into a minor Scottish noble family in the village of Elderslie near Paisley, in Renfrewshire, Scotland. During the late 13th century, Scotland was engaged in a long-running conflict with the English crown over its independence. In 1296, King Edward I of England invaded Scotland and forced the Scottish nobles to submit. However, many ordinary Scotsmen resisted the English occupation, launching hit-and-run attacks from the safety of Scotland's rugged highlands. These guerrilla tactics proved effective, but lacked organization. This all changed with the appearance of William Wallace. By trade, William Wallace was a land-owning knight who had fought in the Scottish-English border conflicts since he was 20. With the rest of the Scottish nobility having submitted to the English, Wallace emerged as a kind of reluctant leader of the resistance. His appointment as Guardian of Scotland in 1298, along with Andrew de Moray, legitimized his authority. Under Wallace's leadership, the Scottish resistance became more organized and effective. He led his troops to a decisive victory over the English at the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297. This victory established Wallace's reputation as a military leader and made him a thorn in the side of the English, an enemy of the crown. After the battle, Wallace continued to harass the English occupiers and refused to accept any peace agreement short of full Scottish independence. However, his refusal to bend to the English crown made him an enemy of the state. The English began offering him noble titles and lands if he would turn against the Scottish people and pledge fealty to King Edward. When Wallace rejected these offers, the English were left with only one option: capture Wallace and execute him. On August 23, 1305, after years on the run, Wallace was betrayed by John Comyn, a fellow Scottish nobleman who was vying for the title of Guardian of Scotland. Wallace was captured and taken to London, where he was put on trial for treason. Unlike the other charges which would have been tried in a local court, treason was considered a crime against the king himself and could only be tried in the king's court. And given that Edward I was the King of England, that meant that Wallace was brought all the way down south to London. In court, Wallace was asked how he pleaded to the charge of treason, to which he replied, "I cannot be a traitor, for I owe Edward no allegiance." And so it was decided that the sentence for this crime against the king would be the most severe and public medieval punishment for traitors: hanging, drawing, and quartering. What is hanging, drawing, and quarter? This method of capital punishment involved 4 distinct steps. The first was hanging. This part of the punishment was meant to break the condemned both physically and mentally. The condemned would be stripped naked and suspended by a rope from a hook in the air, usually for several hours. They would then be castrated while still alive and suspended in the air. Finally, they would be left to slowly strangle to death as the blood drained from their head. The second step of the punishment was disembowelment. After the condemned had been hung, drawn, and quartered, their body would be dragged through the streets by a horse. Their body would be mutilated and dismembered using a sharp instrument such as a knife or a hook. Sometimes the condemned would be disemboweled so that their intestines could be burned before their eyes. The third step of the punishment was the removal of the genitals. If the victim had not yet died during the first 2 steps of the punishment, they would be killed in the third step. Usually the victim would be beheaded or stabbed through the heart. Finally, the condemned would be quartered. This was done either by cutting the body into 4 pieces or by dividing the limbs and torso, leaving the head intact. In some cases, Each of the pieces of the dismembered body would be displayed in a different location. For example, in 1305, when William Wallace was executed, his head was placed on a spike on London Bridge, while his quarters were sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling and Perth. So what happened to William Wallace on the day of his execution? On August 23, 1305, William Wallace was dragged naked behind a horse from the Tower of London to Smithfield, where he was hanged, drawn and quartered. A large crowd gathered to watch the spectacle. Many sympathised with Wallace, seeing him as a martyr for the Scottish cause. The executioners first tied a rope around his neck and then dragged him to the gallows. As he was being dragged, they taunted him and shoved him toward the ground. The rope was looped around a beam, and as they left, the signal was given to hang him. Wallace struggled to free himself, but it was no use. Soon enough, he was dangling in the air, choking as the life slowly drained out of him. But even in this position, Wallace was not done fighting. According to some accounts, as the rope dug into his neck, he somehow managed to jump and free himself from the noose. When the executioner saw that Wallace was still alive, he took out his dagger and plunged it into Wallace's chest. Now truly mortally wounded, Wallace was cut down from the gallows. The crowd gasped as blood rained down onto them. Wallace was still breathing, though, and the show went on. His intestines were pulled out of his body and burned before his eyes. Then his genitals were cut off, and the executioners paraded them around on the ends of their swords. Throughout all this, Wallace remained conscious and defiant. Finally, as a last cruel twist, his head was cut off. His body was cut up, and the 4 pieces were displayed in different parts of the city and throughout Scotland, as we mentioned before. So why did they do it like this? Why was it so brutal? In a letter to the citizens of Aberdeen, shortly after Wallace's execution, Edward the Fern explained his actions. He said that Wallace had committed many evil deeds against the English, and that was why he had been punished in this manner. However, it was not only because of what Wallace had done, but also because of what he represented. Edward then was trying to send a message to anyone else who might consider rebelling against the crown. The message was clear: rebel against the crown, and this is your fate. For his part, Wallace knew what he was up against. In a letter written shortly before his execution, he said that he was ready to die. He wrote, "As for me, I care not though all the crowns of the world were set at the forfeit of my head." Edward the Fern's plan was to use Wallace as a symbolic execution, a show of force to crush Scottish morale. He succeeded in silencing Wallace, but he failed to silence the Scottish resistance. In fact, Wallace's martyrdom only inspired future leaders like Robert the Bruce to keep fighting for Scottish independence. Scotland eventually won independence, but it would take another 3 centuries. Wallace's legacy as a national hero and martyr lived on in Scotland for centuries. His story has been immortalized in legend, literature and film, most notably Braveheart. However, in recent years, some historians have challenged the traditional view of Wallace as a national hero. They point out that much of the traditional story of Wallace, including the famous line about him not caring if all the crowns of the world were set at the forfeit of his head, is based on legend rather than historical evidence. Nevertheless, Wallace's name has become synonymous with the fight for Scottish independence, and his death is still remembered every year on the anniversary of his execution. It's also worth noting that William Wallace is not the only person who has been executed in such a brutal manner. Throughout history, there have been many cases of people being put to death in public in order to send a message to others who might be considering acts of rebellion. Often those executed in this way were seen as martyrs for the cause, and their deaths only served to inspire others to continue the fight. We hope you enjoyed this report. Thanks for watching.